Good morning, good morning, good morning, and good morning. And welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is the new South Africa's land expropriation law that was signed by South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa early this year, January 2025. And it is out of this new law also that has created a lot of controversies, both in South Africa, Europe, and America. For even the British Broadcasting Network, BBC, calling this new law the Land Seizure Act or the Land Seizure Law. I mean, the BBC called this law the Land Seizure Law, pretty much saying that this law is about taking land from white minority South Africans and giving it to black South Africans. That's what pretty much the BBC is trying to say here, fellows. But this law has created so much controversy that even Donald J. Trump, the US president, in an executive order, has granted asylum and refugee status to white South Africans who want to migrate to the United States of America. And the first batch of white migrants, as a matter of fact, arrived last week in Washington Dallas Airport in Virginia. So now this law that has created a lot of controversy all around the world has also brought into question as to why now. Why did it take South Africa so long to pass this law? Because I believe that this law should have been done in 1994 when the ANC and Nelson Mandela came into office in 1994. This should have been one of the first priorities of the ANC government. So why did it take over 30 years after the ANC coming into power to come up with this law? That's the question a lot of South Africans have to ask their leadership. Because these things should have been done 30 years ago. It shouldn't be done 2025. It should never have been done this time. It should have been done 30 years ago. Whatever settlement that the ANC government at that time could have come up with, the white minority farmers and landowners in South Africa at that time, they should have done and gotten rid of this issue. Whichever way this issue would have landed should have been taken care of in the first place. Because this land issue was never going to go away. And that is the mistake the ANC made. And I get it. ANC came into office in 1994. Apartheid South Africa had been in office for forever. And there were sanctions on apartheid South Africa at that time. And ANC came in trying to reboot the economy, trying to get direct foreign investments from these European and American companies into South Africa again, and so on and so forth. So they were more into looking at the industrial and the mining sector of the economy and make sure those economy get rolling to help bring jobs to the black people who have been disenfranchised for so many years. I get all of that. But the land issue, going back to the history of Zimbabwe and the British Lancaster House Agreement, they should have taken that into consideration and remembered that the history repeats itself all the damn time. And this land issue would always rear its ugly head one day. So even though the land issue might have been a minor issue to them at that time, taking into consideration the economy was more important. But the land issue was also very important in the sense that that is what these black South Africans have been crying for in their demonstrations going back in the early 1900s and the late 1800s, when their lands were taken away from them, going back to the first settlers of 1852. when they arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, where they claimed that when they came down there, these lands were not being used, and they saw some Khoi people, the San people, and then the Bantus, but they were all in different areas, and they settled in the area where the land did not belong to nobody, which is all BS anyway. And then come the British, who was able to put everything together, hold that South Africa colony for a while, and then 1910 came in when the British decided to have the South Africa Union. And then unfortunately, 1948 comes the African, what do you call it, African Nationalist Party, which is the apartheid party, coming in 1948. And then carbon copying the Jim Crow laws of American states, southern states, and introducing that same Jim Crow laws of segregation from the southern states of the United States of America into South Africa. So this African Nationalist Party instituted these apartheid laws, which is pretty much the carbon copy of the Jim Crow era of the United States, southern states of America. And the South African blacks had to endure this racist apartheid regime for almost 60 or 80 years under that government, taking their lands away from them. And in the end, A.N.C comes into office in 1994 and decide to go with the old land law that existed in the 1975 Land Act, which pretty much was the willing buyer and the willing seller. So basically, it was the same deal that the Zimbabwean government had with the British, where basically the British agreed to finance some Zimbabwe deals, give them some money. In return, they weren't going to take the land from the white farmers in Zimbabwe, but rather if the white farmers decide voluntarily themselves, decide to sell the land to the government, then that's all well and good. But the Zimbabwean government under Robert Mugabe cannot forcefully take the land from the white farmers until 1997, when Tony Blair, Prime Minister Tony Blair, decided to withdraw from that Lancaster House agreement. That was when Mugabe went and took the land from the white farmers in Zimbabwe. And that also led to sanctions being imposed on Zimbabwe and eventually collapsed the Zimbabwe economy, which to me was even a bad deal anyway. Mugabe should never have taken the land from the white farmers. He should have reached an agreement with them and let them to continue to farm. Because at the end of the day, even if you take the land from these white farmers and you give it to black people, land without money ain't nothing. Because at the end of the day, you need the finance for you to be able to buy equipment, for you to be able to buy fertilizers, for you to be able to farm the land. It's not just having land. You also have to have the money with it to be able to have value and produce on that land. So if the government is not willing to do all of that to help the black people, then you must as well tax the white people and take a certain percentage from them and help and use that to help the blacks, farmers who want to establish their farms, and gradually they seep into the system, and you also provide them with a lot of finance through government money or whatever. But if the government is not ready to do all of that, it doesn't make any sense to take the land from the white farmers who have been farming and contributing and producing for the country and contributing to the economy of the country. And that is what Zimbabwe did. And it collapsed the economy. I mean, this was a country that was benefiting from white farmers. I get it. People say, oh, it was the land belonged to black. I get all of that. The argument I'm making is that, yes, it belongs to black people. These white people have been there for so many, they've been farming on the land. Come on, negotiate with them. Have a deal with them. continue farming on that. We're going to take a certain percentage, agree with them or whatever, and make sure you, the government, use your power also to find other lands to grant it to the black people and help the black farmers who also want to farm. But to take away the farm land from these whites who have established this mechanized form of farming that have to deal with a lot of capital. And then in the end, all these farms collapsing and creating hardship for your own people, you haven't done any good to your own citizens. And that is my point. So even if the South African government is going to do anything, just negotiate with these white folks. I get it. They took the land from the blacks and all of that. But at the end of the day, you can't go back and say that, oh, we're taking the land from them. Negotiate with them. Whatever the settlement has to be. It has to be a win-win settlement. So that the black farmers who wants to farm will benefit from it, as well as the white farmers will also continue to farm on the land and help produce food for the country as well as the black citizens. Because at the end of the day, if they produce, it goes to benefit the same citizens, whether black or white, in that same country. That's my point of view, fellows. But anyway, before I continue with this subject today, fellows, let's go ahead and hear what DW, this German network, that went to South Africa and did an interview with these various South African citizens, both white and black, talking about this issue and their opinion about what this Land Expropriation Act is doing and so on and so forth. And then I'll come back and dissect this whole thing and give you my 2 cents about the end of it. All right, so let's go ahead and hear. By the end of it, it was the corrupt A.N.C. that contributed to this problem. This problem should never have been waited all the way to this time, but the corrupt A.N.C. contributed to it. They live at the expense of their citizens.
77% street debate.
The minority in our country, obviously being the white people, are feeding us.
Africa and South Africa, it belongs to the Bantu people. It belongs to the Ngunis. The land must go back to the chiefs. Land must be expropriated without compensation.
I am a farmer. I've been doing that for 5 years commercially, and I operate on leased land for 5 years. So for me, this is a process that it might not fix everything, but it will get me into the playing field.
Yeah.
If there is today a blanket expropriation happening, they will still not give you the land. If the ANC was in any way serious about giving black people land, I have no problem. They should give black people land.
The government doesn't trust black people with land in this country. And that's evidenced by the millions of title deeds that are held in backlogs. South Africa has a new law, which basically gives the government the framework on how they can acquire private property from individuals, sometimes with no compensation. Obviously, that's got tongues wagging and hairs crossed. So what does it mean for South Africans, particularly young ones? So I want to start with some farmers. And Guguletu, we are on your farm right now. How did you receive the news, or what do you take of this new law?
There is a lot to discuss when it comes to this law. It's very touching for a lot of the youth. Because one, it opens a lot of opportunities and a lot of doors for a lot of us. But at the same time, there's a lot in terms of agriculture on how it really does affect, because the minority in our country, obviously being the white people, are feeding us on a day-to-day basis.
What do you mean when you say feeding us?
In terms of the number of farmers that there are, the white farmers are a very small group, yet the numbers that they're able to achieve in terms of production of food are feeding South Africa and even the Sub-Sahara.
Okay, so let me speak to Tevi here, because you are the white farmer that is being discussed here, right? So for you, how do you take it? Because the government is trying to sell this as a kind of land reform act, and we'll get to the details shortly. But what's your take?
So the main thing to realize is, I believe that property rights and the guaranteed property rights in a country is part of the constitution. And in every country in this world where property rights has been taken from people, that country has started to become a third world country. Now, South Africa is definitely on its way to that. And I believe this could be the last nail in the coffin. So it's very important.
So let me come back to something you've said. You think South Africa is well on its way to becoming a third world country?
Yes, definitely. We can just look at a crime which affects us all. 27,000 murders a year. That is comparable to the third world countries in the world. South Africa is among the top 10 most dangerous countries in the world.
Okay, so coming back to the issue of this expropriation law, I just want to come to you, Bulelwa. How do you see the law?
I think it's important to first set out what the Expropriation Act is not.
Mm-hmm.
The Expropriation Act has nothing to do with land reform. Now, what this act introduces is that it's a balancing act between the interests of the public and the interests of the landowner.
Yeah.
So it makes provision for just and equitable compensation where they look at the history of the acquisition of the property, they look at the state investment, have there been any improvements? And what it does, which I think is what has gotten people in a frenzy, is that it introduces very few instances where expropriation can happen without compensation.
Okay, so before we talk about the compensation issue, Martin here is already shaking his head no. I'm curious to know what exactly you're disagreeing with. Can we agree, first of all, that expropriation has nothing to do with land reform?
This act is not a land reform law, and the difference is that successful countries, Germany, the United States, United Kingdom, Switzerland, South Korea, Japan, etc., all have a very wide degree of deference to owners when expropriating their property. The government says sorry to you by paying you market or above compensation. Now in South Africa, and this is what I was disagreeing about, is that it's not a small list of circumstances in which the government can now seize your property, confiscate your property without paying you a cent. So if you own fixed property anywhere in the country, a house, a business, a warehouse, a farm, and the government says, we think in the public interest, we have to take this without paying you a cent, it is allowed to do that. That is inconsistent with the Constitution.
Okay, so I want to hear from Una here, because your view is actually quite different. Not only do you believe that expropriation needs to happen, you think it needs to happen across the board without compensation.
Exactly, that's correct. Because when you trace the history of South Africa, when you look at the situation of South Africa, my good sir was speaking about crime here. Crime is a result of poverty, and poverty was engineered in South Africa and Africa as a whole. What happened is that in 1652, when the settler arrived here, from that period up until the period of 1910, the land of our people was taken away on grounds that no, this land is not used. The other one, they said, no, this land, it's not being used for anything. So they actually expropriated it without compensation. And actually, when they expropriated it, they were using violence. Okay, that was the nature of colonialism. And then our people ended up in a situation whereby they were forced now to go and work. That land, what it did, 67% of the population of South Africa was allocated to only 7% of the land of South Africa.
Let me just bring our global audience into perspective here. The Native Lands Act is what basically was aligned with apartheid. Black and people of color could not own land. And so before we go on so deep into history, you've taken us back to the 17th century. Yeah. In that case, shouldn't everybody leave the property to the Khoisan, who are thought to be the native occupants of South Africa?
No, actually, Africa and South Africa, it belongs to the Bantu people. It belongs to the Ngunis. So it belongs to the people of Africa.
What about Tavy here?
We are not saying it doesn't belong here. Now that we are living together here, our perspective is that the land must go back to the chiefs, the traditional leaders, and the state. We are unapologetic about this. Mm-hmm. Land must be expropriated without compensation, because this thing of wasting taxpayers' money, buying land that has been stolen.
Okay, we'll come to those details later. I just want to get your response real quick.
I believe the biggest problem in South Africa currently is the government. And if they expropriate the...
Discover your new Hyundai.
All right, fellas. So basically, you heard what is going on with this South African land expropriation law that came into effect this year, January. And you can also tell the division that this law has created in that country, with some people supporting the idea that they can take the land from these white farmers without compensation. But the white farmers also saying that, look, if you take the land from us, then we need to be compensated. So now this is a big issue. I mean, this is a big controversy because now you have a lot of whites in Europe, in America, in New Zealand, and other places who believe that the ANC government, the majority Black government in South Africa now, is discriminating against white folks. And that is why Donald J. Trump also decided to grant them this refugee asylum status, that he signed executive order for them to migrate to the United States. So this is what this land law has pretty much caused this year. That is why I keep saying that this law should never have been this year. This thing should have been done 30 years ago when A.N.C. and Nelson Mandela first came into office. This should have been one of the first things that the A.N.C. should have dealt with, because land was always going to be an issue. I mean, looking at South Africa, looking at the issue of Zimbabwe and what Zimbabwe had to go through, the land was always going to be an issue. But because they dealt with the economy, and because of the issue of the economy, dealing with the mining and the industrial sectors of the economy, and trying to create jobs for the Black minorities who had been disenfranchised for so many years, which made sense. I think they believed that the land issue was not that important compared to getting Black people to work and giving them the opportunity for them to build their lives and become better part of the economy. But they should have also realized, going back to the history, when Black people had always been fighting and calling against the disproportionate ownership of land in that country, that land issue was always going to rear its ugly head one day. And finally, this is where it has come to right now in South Africa. And unfortunately now, you have white people in Europe and America looking at this and saying, hold on, fellows. These people are now trying to take land from the white farmers and so on and so forth. But they are not looking back to the history of that country. But they are looking at what is going on right now in this modern era. And they are making judgment based on this modern era. But if you understand the history, when these lands that belong to the Black people were taken away from them by these white people, then you can understand it. By the end of the day, like I said, it doesn't matter to me how you cut it or slice it. This issue has to be dealt with in a way that the whites will also feel comfortable into any negotiation with the government and so on and so forth. Because looking at it, look, you cannot take the land from the farmers, because like the lady said, the young lady said, I mean, small minority of white farmers pretty much is feeding the whole country. And you need that economy to be booming and growing. So at the end of the day, if you're looking at that, the best thing is for the government to look at the best way of either, if farmers are going to voluntarily themselves give up their some farmlands, or to Black folks and so on and so forth, then so be it. But the government should not take the land from these people and say that, oh, because your great-great-grandfathers took it from the Black people, so we are also going to take it from you. Therefore, I mean, destroying their industry, farming industry, and so on and so forth. Nah. I'm not in that camp, fellows. I'm not in that camp. Let's be pragmatic about this. At the end of the day, it's all about what these farmers are contributing to the economy. And these people contribute tremendously to South Africa's economy. Like the young lady said, they feed the whole country. So there has to be a better way of resolving this issue. Even though you can say, okay, you want to expropriate the land because you don't want to pay compensation. I mean, come on, fellas. There has to be something better than that. There has to be something better than that. But now, my whole take on this thing also goes to the Black South Africans. And my point is that looking at what transpired from 1994, the elites of A.N.C. government were the ones who pretty much benefited from the 90s, 2000, and up to this day. And Ramaphosa is one of them. Zuma is one of them, and all their cronies. These were the people who pretty much have benefited with what they did with the South Africa economy from 1994. Because of most of these guys were very corrupt, and they are still corrupt. What they did was some of them aligned with some white industrialists in that country and used the government policies to channel deals to favor their cronies and themselves in the A.N.C. government at the expense of the native black South Africans. So if the South Africans today are suffering due to the situation that is going on in terms of no jobs and and so on and so forth, they have nobody to blame. They can't blame the white man for that. They cannot blame the white man 30 years after the A.N.C. being in office. They can't blame the white man for that. The blame has to go squarely on the A.N.C. government. And look at the A.N.C. government and their cronies, how much they have benefited from the corruption and the fraudulent deals that they have benefited through these some industrial companies that are owned by some of these white folks in South Africa, whilst majority of the black folks are still suffering. So that's the reality. So I get it. I understand the whole history. I can go back and talk about the Glenn Gray Act of 1894, the Sissy Roads, talking about the whaling buyer and the whaling seller, all of that stuff. You can talk about all of that stuff. By the end of the day, the reality is the reality. South Africa is where it is today because of bad governance, corrupt leadership of the A.N.C. government of South Africa for the past 25 years. Since when Nelson Mandela left the presidency, Thabo Mbeki was good. But right after Thabo Mbeki, the rest were the most corrupt that you can have up to this day. And they are the ones who have pretty much contributed to what South Africans are going through right now in that country. I mean, this is a country that was very developed country. I mean, talk about the industries. I mean, you had defense industry that was in link. I mean, subsidiaries of defense industries in Europe and America, in South Africa. I mean, name it, all kind of industries that South Africans had in South Africa. I mean, South Africa was even developed than a lot of European countries. But today, look at South Africa. And then you look at it, because they came in with this socialist communist mindset. As a matter of fact, prior to Mandela coming in, that is one thing that also held back the economy of South Africa, the uncertainty, because the South Africa A.N.C. government policy at that time was nationalization, government control policies. So a lot of investors from the West, especially America and Europe, were not very comfortable investing in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was first elected, because they weren't sure about the policies that they were going to adopt. But they were coming from this socialist communist background. So it took Mandela a visit to Davos in Switzerland 1992 to convince some of these people that the South Africa A.N.C. government was not going to nationalize industries in South Africa. And yet still, investors were still very wary because they weren't sure if the A.N.C. government was really not going to do that, because that had been their platform of this communist socialist form of governance, believing that government was going to cure all the problems for the South Africans, especially the black people. But unfortunately, it didn't cure the problems. It made their problems worse. But what it did was it enabled the corrupt cronies of the A.N.C. government to become wealthy and enrich themselves at the expense of the majority black South Africans. So fellas, this is all I have for today. It is a very unfortunate chapter. But if it's Sunday, it's the Africa Weekly Talk. God bless you guys and have a great week. Thank you guys, and peace and love.